What do you know about art? A lot more than I do, because I know all. But having read this biography of Francis Bacon, turns out analysis and critique is often more revealing of the critic than the art or artist. And so, down this rabbit hole we shall go. So you must have had that experience where a painting grabbed your attention and stopped you mid-thought. It's like a moment of zen. You only know you went somewhere, or stopped being here, however you want to perceive it, because you became aware of the coming back portion of that experience. Then the mental itch starts. What did I just see? What did I just experience? And it was an experience, an emotional response, visceral, can't quite be put into words, abstracted, beyond linguistics, into the surreal. Started asking all those metaphysical questions like, why has someone done the Smurf version of Human Centipede? Those soft, fluffy and baby smooth blue butts ruined, as now are my childhood memories and maybe yours too. Yeah, someone did that, it's a thing. Childish behaviour or subversion of expectations, who knows. But yeah, Human Centipede, if you've seen the movie, you know. If you haven't, well, we all make bad life choices from time to time. Human Centipede 1, that was an experience. It had it all. Sexual tension, medical procedures, body horror, a touch of the macabre, and the futility of resistance. And as I think about it, pertinent themes when talking about bacon. Not the crispy kind. Human Centipede 2, a cheap facsimile to cash in on the popularity and outrage and notoriety of Human Centipede 1. And Human Centipede 3, final sequence, a self-referential parody of the first, as is often the case with franchises, and it seems the problem of the artist as well. Well, I say problem, but I mean function. It's what the successful ones do, and like I say, I'm naive to this and wonder if there is such a thing as an unsuccessful artist. Is that one of those oxymorons, or would it classify as post-modern contrarian? I'm no good at my categories, but a quick look down the Wikipedia entry at the different genres of art is mind-blowing. Such a rich tapestry of exploration. I never knew. Horror, body horror, gore, effluvials, viscera. It's all part of what we're about to talk about today. Why do we stop and gawp? We talked about this in episode 12, Rubbernecking. But this is more sublime. There's a beauty, an allure that beckons like a whisper, and we almost miss it. Is there something there? It sort of looks like something, but the context, the contortions, the colours almost look familiar, something we don't see very often. The unconscious has picked up on something, and the logic brain just loves to solve riddles. It's got us. We know we're going to get a dopamine hit if we are clever enough to get it. The approval junkie in us. But no, that's just the obvious stuff, and the abstract painter has gone further, far further. A while ago I learned a term, Eudaimania. I think it was one of Plato's, wasn't it, that had 4 main points. The first one was think more. All too often we go along with conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is often wrong, and Plato advocated know yourself by subjecting your ideas to scrutiny and to strengthen your self-knowledge so that you get pulled around less by feelings. This is the flight, fight, freeze and repeat response that we talked about last time. Point 2 was let your lover change you, meaning where you have shortfalls, let those who you implicitly trust change you. Be open to them and take on their skills, outlook and values. Each should seduce the other into wanting to be a better person. This applies equally in business. Point 3, decode the message of beauty. Beautiful things are whispering important truths to us about the good life. We find things beautiful that have qualities we sense we need but are missing in our lives. Therefore, beautiful things help us to educate our souls, as it were. Ugliness is a serious matter too. It parades dangerous and damaged characteristics in front of us. Therefore, art is therapeutic. Find the beauty, decode it, absorb it. And point 4, reform society. A little bit out of the bounds of this episode, but Plato observed how few people thought properly before they voted and therefore got very substandard rulers. He wanted to stop people voting until they thought rationally. That is, until they had become philosophers. Otherwise government would just become mob rule. Yeah, here we are. So that said, I'm now going to show my ignorance, but that's part of the scrutiny process, I guess. Plus, I suppose even putting forward a notion for scrutiny provides the opportunity for others to think, yeah, some ideas aren't worth sharing, and I think that's where the greats stand out. They go beyond the obvious, beyond that, and are almost unreachable, almost unassailable, perhaps even abstract. And I think it's like a world-class problem solver. The distinction is in the questions they ask, not the answers they shit out. Or some well-worn cliché or motivational saying that's doing the rounds at the moment. So the questions have to lead the interlocutor to insight. That's why I'm a bit of a fan of street epistemology. And I just note recently that Peter Boghossian has made the headlines by providing institutions with a learning opportunity, but it seems they've missed it. And also, while I mention it, maybe check out Anthony Magnabosco. But not just yet. Finish this video first. So here we are, question of modern art. What insights does it deliver? And I think what I like about this is that there are no limits on the category or extent of that question. So to make that point, a quote from Pepiat's biography on Bacon. He notes that one of Bacon's partners once scowled at him. "You've ruined my life. You've ruined it completely by making me think about myself the whole time." Once Bacon had scrutinised you, you remained painfully aware of the subterfuges and compromises, the half-truths and less-than-bests by which, in a pact sealed over the years, you've had to agree to live with yourself. Indeed, reading Pepiat's book was like living a lifetime in a few days. It took me a while to get through it, and condensing a lifetime into 80 or 90 minutes, however long this is going to last, is an absurd proposition. It's too much compression, and the fidelity is lost, and the nuance gives way to kind of cliches and summations that perhaps approximately correct, but miss the point. Nevertheless, taking time to reflect on the themes and the questions Bacon raises is to me what art is all about, just as Plato expressed. What do we observe as lacking in our lives? What do we hold dear? What do we believe? Is it true? And how did we come to that belief? Via a reliable way to know truth? Or is it just another crutch, an attachment? Are we make-believing because it's convenient, easy? Is life to be taken seriously? Or is it a joke? They say to believe in yourself. Does that mean to delude oneself? Or does it mean that to believe, the evidence to justify such belief needs to exist, and if it doesn't, we have to make it, and by doing so, we actually manifest the change that actually does make the belief true. A real make-belief, rather than a false pretend belief. These questions, I'm sure, have been asked a million times before. That's nothing new. It seems the basis of existentialism and surrealism, and a step further, abstract surrealism. It reminded me of that episode of Star Trek on Next Generation. It's called The Inner Light. And it's in the story where the Captain Picard is struck unconscious by an energy beam from an alien probe, and while minutes pass for the rest of the crew, the probe makes Picard experience 40 years of a lifetime in an alien civilization. At first, Picard's bewildered and he tries to work out how to escape it, but after a while he realises that it's kind of like a tight, well-defined environment. There's no resources to get out, there's no starship, there's no communicators, and eventually he comes to acceptance and lives his life out as one of the natives, eventually succumbing to old age and dying in the normal course of things. But one of the things he did during this life, as well as integrate with the locals, and take on their lifestyles and understand their values and their ways, he learned to play a flute. And the end of the Star Trek episode sees Picard wake up back on the Enterprise, and the alien probe is brought on board for analysis, and inside he finds the flute. Of course, he has to test it, doesn't he? So he picks up the flute and naturally, somehow, has retained the musical skills that he learned during his 40 years of another life. So let's start at the beginning with a point and then move to a line to give us direction and spread out to a surface, a field to give us a bit of body and substance, the tapestry, as it were. Born in Ireland in 1909, died 1992, and quite the dash between. By all accounts, I didn't really read into it too much, quite distant parents, not a great loving relationship, a little bit turbulent. I think the family motto was everything by moderation. In his early 20s, he lived in London on an allowance of £3 a week from his mother's trust fund. reading Nietzsche. Around this time, I think it was in his early 20s, he started taking up painting. Destroyed more paintings than he let live, and a small but thriving market still exists for frames and canvases of his that survived the destruction process or that were smuggled out with the rubbish. Yep, 80 grand gets you a wooden frame and 4 square inches of remaining attached canvas with a bit of paint on it. But it was never about money, not for Bacon. His format, often large pictures in triptych or diptych format around a single theme. And his famous pieces in the 1950s were the Screaming Pope series, and then the 1960s, the Crucifixions. In the 70s, it was portraits of friends and self, and in the 80s, simplification, as he described it. So in his 20s, he took up painting a brief stint as an interior decorator, and his breakthrough piece was 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion in 1944. The paintings caused a sensation when exhibited in 1945. The popes and large triptychs in their time commanded the highest prices at auction. By 1989, Bacon was the most expensive living artist after one of his triptychs sold at Sotheby's for over $6 million. In 2007, one of his paintings was sold at a record price of $14.2 million. On May 2008, the triptych, 1976, dated, sold at Sotheby's for €55 million. Then a record for the artist and the highest price paid for a post-war work of art. In November 2013, Studies of Lucian Freud sold at Christie's, New York for $142 million, a new record for the highest auction price of a work of art at that time, beating Edvard Munch's Scream, but now held by Da Vinci's Salvator Mundi. So someone somewhere sees the value. Ironic, really, because in some of the interviews I watched on YouTube, Bacon would say, "Oh, I suppose we'll have to wait 50 years after I die to see if they're any good." Well, I don't know whether he'd be surprised or shocked, or I don't know. I'm not sure what he'd do, actually. Probably raise his glass and say, "Oh, I hope it brings him a lot of bloody pleasure." Now, in podcast 12, we talked about rubbernecking and the curious interest with the likes of Charles Manson. And we talked about the fascination with these outliers, the archetype epitomised in Hollywood by the fictional characters Hannibal Lecter, dark, malevolent power, the dark triad all over again. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. We have no power, and maybe that's a commentary on why films like The Avengers and other superhero films are popular. For a moment we can project our needs in a fantasy, but a rare few do have actual power. But absolute power is expensive. It's an optimization problem. Talked about that in number 13, I think. Furthermore, this cost is often hidden to conceal the weakness. We'll come on to this more in a few moments, but consider the British Navy was once the strongest in the world. It implemented the so-called two-power standard. It was twice as strong as the next largest navy. This meant that if the second largest navy ganged up with the third largest navy, the British would still, in theory, win. Lanchester's law and warcraft, strategy and tactics aside. This kind of reasoning is also built into blockchain and cryptos, but that's another story for another day. But the basic idea there is that the distributed computing power required means that no one compute node can abuse the system. You need to have at least 50% of the computational power working on the blockchain at any one time to be able to subvert that chain. So if you think about all the millions and millions of computers in action all day that people use on something like Bitcoin, it means that you would need the equivalent of half of all that to try and break into it. So let's say you need 5 million PCs. Well, I don't know, even supercomputers might struggle with that. And that's the point, that the cost of constructing a supercomputer or taking that much compute power offsets any gain by abusing the blockchain. So again, the cost of constructing and maintaining such a large navy was immense and needed money from somewhere. And yeah, you know, that's another ROI calculation. Wonder where the money came from. So guess who at the moment has more military bases around the world? And then the next question for 10 points. What is the world reserve currency? Bingo. Yeah, fascinating. But the cost structure and optimizations required to administer is phenomenal. And that's just one part of the government. And then another part is countrywide, nationwide infrastructure, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, looking after its future taxpayers to pay off national debt. So again, medical infrastructures, health infrastructures, and education. It's huge costs, very complicated, also fascinating. But most of us are not privy to the goings-on in circles of the elites. The myths of the Rockefellers and Rothschilds perpetuate in conspiracy theories, and maybe some of it's even true, and so what? And neither do most of us have opportunity provided by advantages of such family wealth, and I mean real wealth. Nor do we happen to live close to a tech innovation centre with buddies and friends in leading seed capital companies based across the road. Nor do we have an uncle who knows someone at ISDA to get that licence to print money, and so on. And this is the game to break into that, to get a bit of power. Consequently, serial killers have attributed to them the prestigious titles of high IQ. A case of correlation, not causation. The dumb killers are usually caught after their first bungled heinous crime. It's the careful ones, smart ones, that evade capture for so long that enables them to rack up the body count. So it might not just be that serial killers are necessarily smart, it's just that the dumb serial killers get caught only after the first murder and can't, therefore, count as a serial. I suspect the same with successful entrepreneurs, good financing, fertile grounds, rich, long-lost relatives and inherited fortunes that give a certain survivability to endure 2 or 3 catastrophic failures, just one of which would wipe out us mere mortals, but I'm told we need those mistakes to learn from. Power, yeah, something a lot of us want more of, and the allure of characters like Hannibal Lecter, confined, smothered, gagged, bound and locked away from view and forgotten in solitary confinement, even so are still the centre of it all, and they use their wiles to plan years ahead, impossibly smart, impossibly well-read, impossibly knowledgeable. And for all this we forgive them being mass murderers, because their traits of cunning, fearlessness, manipulative charm, and the ability to defeat any and all opponents are coveted by us mere mortals, much in the same way vampires are cheered on in the first 3/4 of the film, but in the end they must die, as we recognise their megalomania and ultimately destructive tendencies will see them lust eventually after our blood. Power, unrestrained by social constraints, economic considerations, sometimes lives in castles, are not constrained by law, comfortable in the shadows of the underworld and equally at ease with high society and the financing elites, a chameleon, a kind of shapeshifter, an undefinable enigma. We just want power, if only by proxy, and we forgive those wicked acts as we derive benefit from our temporarily aligned interests. Sure, the vampires pick on society's undesirables at first, cleaning up the place, taking out the trash, whether it's lowly street scum or highly placed corrupt officials. The serial killer vampire archetype is indiscriminate and eliminates either with equal ease and indifference. But this isn't a favour to us. We think too much of our own importance to such tyrants. It feels good when they acknowledge us, smile at us, wink at us, and we are captivated. Yes, they're on our side, until they focus their power on us. Probably why Manson got so many fan letters. Weird. Power appeals, even in dark and destructive form, and I kind of recognise this in Pepiat's description of Francis Bacon's life experience. Not Bacon himself, mind you. I think he was a lot more grounded than that. Nevertheless, his youth saw the rise of Nazi power, the conflict of war, social changes, and the antagonisms at many levels of power, emotions and logic, feelings and expressions, interpersonal relations, sexual power, legal power, commercial, social and political power, which seemed in the end to be his inspiration, and as Pepiat notes, these massive contradictions, or antagonisms as I would say, could be held together only by the unifying power of art. And I wonder too if he wasn't partly responsible for the deconstructivism. Bacon was at ease with London's criminals and just as at ease with the high society of London, Paris and Monte Carlo. Similarities also extended to the seedier side of nighttime London and the allure of being an undefinable enigma, compelling, intriguing, interesting, flawed yet whole, and non-judgmental, accepting, and despite a nihilistic outlook, he expressed a celebration for life, because, well, since it doesn't matter, you might as well make the most excellent use of it, which necessitates bumping right up to those awkwardly constraining bondages of inner demons, sexual exploration, social acceptance, laws, politics, and even physical limits. So, much like the Royal Navy during its heyday, if you've explored your limits to twice the extent of other people you encounter, then your requisite variety of behavioural choice is much wider, and the law of requisite variety states, if a system is to be stable, the number of states of its control mechanism must be greater than or equal to the number of states in the system being controlled. As Boy Lotto says in his book Deviate, well, it's in the title, Deviate, or as he explicitly states in the book, Travel. Therefore, high IQs can be a bit of a curse as well as a blessing, seeing the patterns in life through travel and deviation. Choose up a lot of novelty, and then we start to yearn for something new, and the minutiae of life becomes boring. A recurring theme in Pepiat's book. Bacon captured the essence of things, stripped away the fluff, as summed up by the expression made famous by Lewis Carroll, the smile without the cat, and, paraphrasing Valerie, the sensation without the boredom of its conveyance, something for which I hope I am not guilty of right now. Bacon was fascinated by people, especially those who seemed to live like our familiar vampires, rich enough to indulge in any fantasy, unrestrained in places that catered to any whim for a price. The real human behaviours came out, revealing the deepest secrets of motivation. He liked to watch the arguments of the super-rich, and one story tells of how on the Côte d'Azur he would watch from his balcony the goings-on of the super-rich, and the boredom they endured, and the fanciful madness indulged to break that boredom. One woman got so bored, she went back to her hotel room several stories up, and threw her dog out of the window. It landed on the awnings below, gave everyone something to talk about for a while, and relieved the boredom. This story and many others in the book reminded me of Hannibal Lecter, and how he relieves the boredom. The subtext is fascinating. Just how many things have these people ticked off the bucket list, to have been there and everywhere, with everyone and anyone, to have accomplished so much, to have seen it all, and to be that bored with life. Is it inconceivable? Bacon, always keen to meet someone new, with mock world weariness, he claimed, to relieve the boredom just for an instant, many a truth said in jest. He saw a lot of wealthy places. It attracts the extremes, the rich, the leechers, the con men and the beggars. It was the people with money that seemed more transparent and blatant about their intentions, for good or for bad. And like many of us, he had a fascination with lawlessness, but it seemed he travelled or deviated more than most of us would risk, and that brought him increasingly in contact with several of the most notorious criminals of the day. Bacon's nature was to push every experience to the limit. There was no limit, and men who went as far as murder could hardly fail to have a magnetism. His own code of conduct was to live and let live on a grander scale as possible, and the notion of actively harming someone was abhorrent to him. Nevertheless, a man so unconstrained by ordinary morality as to make a profession out of violence was bound to fascinate Bacon, who had long subscribed to a Nietzschean view of existence, much in the same way we are fascinated by tales of power. It seems that real players actually go out and find it for real, rather than by the safe proxy of a movie screen or even a painter's canvas. He even said of his death he'd prefer to be buried than cremated, as it would be a bore for people if they had no bones to dig up. He was fascinated with the unexplained, or things for which there was no apparent explanation. Luck or chance if they worked in his favour, jinx if they didn't. Typical confirmation bias, aren't we all of this nature? The unexplained, the mystery. Is it a threat? Should I be worried? What is it? Let's slow down and have a look. A little rubbernecking, why not? We are simply not aware of things we are not aware of, therefore the explanations escape us. Not that there isn't one, as Nietzsche put it. There's no way of telling what yet may become of history. Perhaps the past is still yet undiscovered. One thing that Pepiat emphasised through his book is, and it really came through, is the filters through which we see life, and the explanations that we attribute to things are often a result of our filters, described at length in Bolotto's book, again, Deviate. And I don't know whether this kind of fake or false or fiat explanations for things that we dream up make it so that these things become familiar to us and are no longer unknown. One might imagine many years ago the volcano erupting, tens of thousands of years ago. We didn't know about plate tectonics. We didn't know about lava plumes. It was just the angry gods, and throwing virgins into it seemed to settle it down. But of course, that was just coincidence. And then when we gave it a name and a deity to worship, it became the familiar. It still didn't stop it erupting and destroying and killing everyone, but it was just familiar and not so frightening anymore. Delusion. So we're left meandering through our coincidences, that recurring patterns instill a familiarity that eventually becomes boring, or for some I suppose comforting. And Bacon seems to me that he sensed this, and that's why he knew photography was killing the realist art, therefore art needed to innovate its way out. The Hollywood problem. The new is novel, innovative. The cheap sequel is the same thing done, only on half the budget to squeeze out profits, riding the swell of popularity and invested marketing. And when the swell isn't big enough, well, that's when we start jumping the shark. And then the third film in that franchise often seems to be little more than a parody. Why not? Push the limits. Speaking of which, I see we've got a new crop of films coming out in 2019. Rambo, Last Blood, Terminator, Dark Fate. These are apt titles, don't you think? It's all about the darkness this year. The end of times, the last. So instead of the new, we're getting the last. It's quite an interesting spin. What's also interesting to me in regard of these films, and perhaps the reason why I mention it, especially in regard to Bacon and the book and living a lifetime and leaving a legacy, is it seems that there's this fashionable pattern where a CEO who has been involved with a company for 30 or 40 years hits retirement in the late 60s. At the time that he's about to hand it over, which is usually a year or two project in of itself to the incoming CEO, they'll write a book on the way out. And I'm kind of reminded of Lou Gerstner and his book about his time at IBM. It's to write down how they did it. It's to kind of decompress. It's to protect their almost intellectual investment in it. This is how it was done. This is how I did it. This is a legacy that I created. Here it is documented. And I wonder if these films, like the last Rambo film and perhaps the last Terminator film with Schwarzenegger in it, are kind of a legacy sign-off, a swan song. Don't get me wrong, I grew up on 80s action films, and as I mentioned in the previous episode, and I get the feeling that these are no doubt expensive films, but we've seen it all before. Yet out of some weird fascination or some sense of inner duty or to honour that youthful investment, we've kind of bought into the memes and the metaphors that give meaning to our life in reference to that kind of pop culture of the times. I'll be back. We all know what that means. And it compresses sentiments, meanings, feelings and time, and it conveys something not just about the message, but it has a meta-narrative. I think probably this is what memetics is all about. That's not a knife. Get away from her, you bitch. Yippee-ki-yay. I feel the need. Wax on, wax off. So there seems to be a strange phenomena, it's the Terminator franchise has been abused, kicked around, recycled, rehashed for all it's worth, appealed to a new audience, yeah, but the old original was the new at the time, and ever since it's just been a replica of itself. But I feel compelled to watch, maybe not on immediate release, but at some point, just for closure, just to see how the meme or the metaphors closed out. But it's also a reflection of self, because, if you're my age, you perhaps remember hearing these things when they first came out, and it was deeply anchored to a particular time, a particular place, a particular zeitgeist, and here we are 20, 30 years later, and it's a reminder or a reflection of what's changed. So there's a certain compulsion to watch. I don't know whether it's a kind of morbid fascination with self, and I guess that's what this is all about. Bacon's art raised questions. He seldom, if ever, gave answers, saying that there was nothing to explain, which just raises more questions. And I think from a meta position or an existentialist position, it's either quite clever or the only honest answer. So as I proposed in video number 14, the truth is a description of the perfect instance that approaches the conclusion from infinite investigation, an endless regression of questions that blazes answers along the way but never reaches the answer. Just like calculus computes the sum in the case where dx approaches zero but never actually gets there. So one interpretation of this is that Bacon comes across as guarded, and later we might see why. The context of the times towards homosexuals, for instance, is kind of parental rejection. I mention this not as a remarkable point or as anything in particular to note, but just that the non-acceptance of society and the law at the time meant that by necessity he needed to be guarded. Imagine being rich and famous and having forbidden relationships or deep dark secrets. The anxiety of abuse that could lead to, either blackmail or such, meant that liaisons were often anonymous and therefore actually more dangerous, more risky. And what to do when physically abused or taken advantage of or robbed? Well, one could hardly go to the police and file a complaint about one's homosexual lover. Yeah, I must do a episode on Joseph Whale. Anyway, besides, Bacon was a bit of a gambler. And more remarkable to me, something I remember recalling a little bit in a book called The Road Less Travelled, is that despite the implicit judgment placed upon him, as far as I can tell, he himself was not. And the phrase that pops out in the book often that he repeated is, well, there it is. I get the impression that he would avoid labelling people, except in the case of a weird kind of a term of endearment that on the face of it would sound to you and me like an insult, but perhaps recognition that he too was one of those. It's more about acceptance. Well, it happened and can't be changed now, might as well get on with it. And this attitude towards life and towards other things seems to be a theme. For example, he would use the reverse side of the canvas in his paintings, not the prepared side. On a tangent, arousal, as it turns out, is an interesting aspect of risk, and heightened encounters increase arousal. It actually lowers inhibitions, and perhaps there is a secret to life in there. To always be aroused, to always be in uptime, high-performance states, as the self-help crowd says. Yeah, they always go on about taking risks, and I suppose if you're aroused or curious or in a high-performance state, it doesn't quite come across as so risky. And again, I kind of see a link, just my layman's observation, that perhaps it's the dopamine release, or the epinephrine release, or oxytocin, whatever it is in the brain that's released that happens when we're aroused, seems to have the same effects as the class A's. But, to also recognise this as a potential weakness when making important decisions. So, lock them out, as it were. Set it up so that someone else executes when you are in an aroused state, or make the hard decisions when they're easy, at times when the best context is suitable. And as they say in finance, always put your financing in place when you don't need it. I.e. plan and book and pay for the cab in advance of going to the pub and getting shit-faced. This way you are free to drift in the depths of spending the last of your cash on booze, unrestrained, no need to be concerned with keeping money aside for the cab fare home. It's already planned, it's already booked, it's already done, because of course, when you're 10 or 12 pints in, inebriated, and then have to make the decision, do I spend the last £20 on a cab, or do I have another drink and reach for the car keys after? So Bacon grew up in London during the Blitz, when nighttime would see blackouts and the anxiety of dropping bombs exploding without notice was prevalent. Danger sharpens the senses. This is a constant theme throughout the book. Take risks with sexual encounters. Take risks running an illegal casino. Take risks being outrageous in art. And the theme of the unseen dark agent is ever present. The authorities. The risk of anonymous homosexual encounters, blackmail. The risk of being caught running illegal casinos. The risk that art critics and punters may or may not like the work. These are referred to as like the dark agents, the seekers, the watchers in the background, the kind of men in black of the day as we'd call them today, or as Bacon called them, the unseen agents, the furies. What also struck me about arousal and inhibitions is the number of stimuli that can be used to trigger. colours, shapes, ratios in art and marketing, such as food packaging, and even the look and presentation of food itself is a stimulus. It's an arouser. It lowers inhibitions. That looks good. Must have some. Nevertheless, Bacon could be very crass. Also, the language he used is very levelling. It's a kind of reduction treatment that we're all the same pond slime at the end of the day, just worm food. Apart from this sounding depressing, I get the impression that he used it as an excuse to celebrate. You're going to die, I'm going to die, we're all going to die, we're all in the same sad tragedy, so we might as well live the best we can before the worms have us all. So, rejected by his parents for reasons and views of the time, still going on today, Bacon believed in instinct and chance, but in the same sense that there is a meandering path, always options, always possibilities. So he was okay with drifting in life, moving around, going with the flow. So he went to Germany and explored the Berlin underground scene, explored vices and fetishes and everything that was catered for. The theme of emotional violence is brought up, and some of his early influences are mentioned. Films like Metropolis, Battleship Potemkin, and he knew Charlie Chaplin. Maybe even worth watching some of his films to be found on YouTube. Very astute observations of the quiet lives of the desperate. It also seems a recurring theme that Bacon went with the flow, chance or luck, followed it where it led, and then went further. Same with his paintings, and if he didn't like it, it got scrapped. Nevertheless, he would say he was keen to find out where the painting was going, and in the book it's more than hinted at that this is a non-conscious effort. Consequently, I think about arousal and inhibitions, and Joe Rogan comes to mind, and his perpetual readiness to invite people to their DHT experience. Yeah, remember kids, just do drugs, don't say no. Another subverted and parodied 80s cliché. So something I picked up on in paintings and art is how it can imagine being different characters. For example, and quoted in the book, Poussin's Massacre of the Innocent. What's going on there? So many different characters, and the expressions on their faces show that they are interpreting the events in very, very different ways. And so I'm reminded of the 4 perceptual positions we can choose to look at things. First position, through our own eyes. Second position, through the eyes of the person we're looking at. Third position is from almost an impartial observer that observes the first position and the second position. And then there's a fourth position, the whole system, observing it in its entirety from a further remote or abstracted position, I suppose. So I wonder if you see it too, that with a painting we have the time to explore ourselves. We can take time to fight it. We can take time to flee from it, to freeze in awe or shock, or to appease with our approval, or in fact have it approve our beliefs. Yes, that's exactly how I see the world. Do you find that with films sometimes it goes too fast? So I think I kind of just realised what pacing is all about in a film. It's giving the audience time. Never really understood what that meant before. So, quick question. A big study on sales was done a few years ago, and it asked an amazing question. During communication with a prospect or during the sales process, what is the average length of silence that salespeople can endure before they feel compelled to break that awkward silence and say something? So, think about this in terms of pacing and whether the interlocutor is having insight after a really good quality question and they're internalizing, processing, and then they're rudely interrupted by the salesperson saying anything to break the silence. The answer is, but before that, the essence of Bacon seemed to be a dynamic tension, a contradiction. Indeed, the title of Pepiat's book is Anatomy of Enigma. Without tension, there is no interest, nothing to learn, no conflict, no question, no antagonism, no drama, no interest. And we talked last time about getting attention, creating impact, a la Dave Trott's model. And as Steven Pinker pointed out, the use of effluvial language gets attention as impact, probably for evolutionary reasons. However, the skill, the craft, the art is to parlay that into something else, to chain that anchor to a question for the observer, something to resolve, a question that just asks another question. Why was this painted? What kind of mind paints this? Why do I feel funny about this? Is this a new feeling? What does that say about me? Are others affected by this, or is it just me? Would I feel awkward or embarrassed to ask someone else? What does that say? Do others talk about this? What's the social thing to do? What's the legal thing to do? Is this legal what I'm even looking at? Is it obscene? Am I complicit in its creation? And now that I realise that, and I see what's in the picture, could this have come from my imagination, or was it actually already there? Shit. Is there a dark part of me I don't know about? Is there a bit of Hannibal Lecter in my mind? Cool. Bacon would collect medical knowledge and photographs and renders of patients in states of hysteria, and he was fascinated by the ones that looked indistinguishable to expressions of ecstasy. From what I gather, his boundaries and levels of judgment were very low, but his curiosity very high. He had met Picasso, of course, and commented that no one had ever come closer to the core of what feeling is about. Picasso known for his cubism and surrealism. What fascinated Bacon was the ability of artists to jolt the senses and create a sense of threat. The desire to shock was present in contemporary art of the time. There is an underlying theme in Pepiat's book that Bacon would make efforts to avoid being categorised by the critics, much in the same way I suppose that Hannibal Lecter avoids psychoanalysis in the Silence of the Lambs film. However, I'm not sure this was deliberate. Certainly the mystique was not unhelpful, but I also think he was experimenting and didn't want to put limits on his work or himself by labelling. The judgments and evaluations are just so bloody limiting. So it's not lost on me that our early podcasts about Carol Dweck's books have similar echoings. Furthermore, Bacon was keenly aware that the masks we wear, we do so to pretend we are that which we think others would accept. Seems the price of pretend freedom is hypocrisy. And was it Alan Watts who said, "I am who you think I am"? Or was it that I think I am what you think I am? No, I think I am what I think that you think I am. Oh, it's so bloody confusing. Nevertheless, it seems to me that Bacon was not interested in paying that price, nor taking part in the childish charades, but in the viscera, the blood and guts, the piss and shit, if you like. Bacon had seen how the surrealists equated the desire to express something new with the need to shock, and it was to form the core of his own artistic beliefs. But going along with this journey with the author of the biography, even this seems to be a bit of a charade, as by the end of his life he had realised simplification, that most of the things that we think matter don't. But we'll get on to that. What comes through, though, is a strong sense that we wear these masks for so long, we forget that it's okay to be ourselves, it's okay to be a little bit off-kilter, a little bit psychotic, to have dark fantasies, to indulge in fetishes, and after so long we get stuck in the charade of it all. It's kind of hilarious. To quote directly from Pepiat's book, in the malicious serenity of old age, Francis Bacon enjoyed dismissing his youth as a chapter of accidents and ineptitude relieved by the odd revelation. He saw himself as awkward and aimless, tossed out into the world with little more than deep, unresolved conflicts inside him. He had to test himself against all kinds of frustrations and failures before he could begin to bring to the surface the monstrous vision of pain and distress he felt impelled to express. Bacon comes across as a studier of people, a renderer of psychology in paint, and he mixed with the elites and the gangsters, putting on, or perhaps assuming, the part in the charade. After all, if life is a progression of performances, why restrict oneself to just one role? Why settle for just one identity? Maybe afraid of being labelled a schizo because others can't pigeonhole you? Or are our beliefs so tightly wound with our identity we simply can't? I mean, for the men out there who are listening, would you wear a dress? For those who say no, why not? I mean, I won't, and for those reasons too. I'm restricting myself based on what? Personal constraint? Social constraints? Fear of being judged? Yeah, weird. Lots of friends in the past really enjoyed Rocky Horror Show. I just didn't get it. Nothing against it, I just thought, what's all that fuss about? Didn't get it. So the book makes a point about Bacon's unresolved conflicts at a young age. Gosh, don't we all have these? I'm also wondering about the author. It seems relative. That is to say, if you have a very narrow and focused sense of identity and very narrow and specific beliefs about the world, if you have a very black and white view about things, sure, the world is rendered simple, polarised, and our internal conflicts are minimised. But I find that puts a tremendous cost on society at large. Here we go again. Societal restrictions, legal restrictions, which probably reveals my thinking about things. Am I a fighter, flighter, freezer or appeaser? And there's a bit of political strategy inside I recently discovered. How to win in war and politics and get your own way, the two-power standard, revisited. It's quite simple. Imagine a scenario where a decision has to be made, but there's a split 3 ways, and you can see what's coming. When any one of the third makes effort to persuade the electorate or the other 2/3, well, they lose out, even where one of those other thirds is apathetic to that particular solution or proposition. It becomes intractable. So how to resolve? So we already said the answer. Lanchester's law, divide and conquer. Split one of those thirds into 2 and give concessions or polarise for votes. Well, of course, this might take time for those vertical niches or separations in demographics to actually be fractionated or segregated. This is like that negotiation model where 2 sides have nothing in common. Negotiator goes in and has to start building values on each side, or inspire them or motivate them to create new values independently, and then keep in check to see if mutual values spontaneously develop, and there is the basis for common ground. It takes time because it has to be independently self-actualized, i.e. the negotiator can't go in and say what you need is this value and what you need is that value, because that often backfires. But just a note, in current UK politics as of June 2019, it seems that the Conservatives have run out of money. Well, a classic supply line problem. Won the war but went broke doing it. The winner's curse. So, to do this kind of exercise is a long-term game and requires a lot of PR and requires getting in those groups, splitting them up, segregating, doing the marketing in the PR, and that all takes a lot of money and a lot of time, or if you want it even faster result, even more money, which they don't seem to have right now. So this Brexit thing's going to drag on. We've got a third that want to leave, a third that want to stay, and a third that are kind of apathetic to it all. But yeah, if that can be polarised into 2 groups, then all we need is just one more person in our group than the other group. Democracy. Anyway, that all by the side. In later life, he embellished his youthful bad boy image. Maybe that's the way he remembered it, or wished for it to be remembered, or it was what people enjoyed listening to. After all, the truth is often rather boring and painful and unpleasant. So why the fuck not make it interesting? Take a bit from Nietzsche, that the past is yet undiscovered. Just don't bore people. Reluctant to seek tuition, Bacon had inclination to seek the pain, perhaps as a way of finding a solution to bring to the world, or at least to express it. His marketing strategy then was to give people a good time, to provide a space for their debauchery, a space to drift, an excuse or at least a plausible reason for them to drop their masks, to let up on their hypocrisy, to get drunk and indulge and gosh, maybe even enjoy the discovery of silence, maybe buy some of his artwork without judgment. It seems one of the tricks in life to make it okay for people just to be themselves so that simple things feel good once again. It comes back to Dweck and acceptance. In the early days his output was rugs and furniture, but above all it seemed also that leverage gained over and above the transaction was as important, that people were entertained and had a good story to tell about others, of course, at that party. The social media of the day, gossip, networking effects, connection before correction, and all that stuff. Whenever he'd travel, Berlin, Paris, Tangier, South France, he'd pick up the latest trends and bring them back to London. This seemed to be a valuable lesson from the business world too, travel, and what Bo Lotto recommends from his book Deviate. Travel, not just physically, but mentally. Take on new ideas, new beliefs, try new identities, the law of requisite variety and all that. Yeah, we've already done that bit. Move on. Earlier in his life, his parents had told him that no one would be interested in him because he was awful looking. One wonders what happened to his parents to say such a thing. Perhaps it was a way of keeping him distant from other people. Perhaps they themselves had bad experiences with people and kind of used this as a subconscious or unconscious projection to keep him away from harm, but inadvertently and ironically and contradictorily actually did more harm. So perhaps they'd travelled just enough to get hurt and abused, but not enough to go through it That theme kind of comes through again with Bacon, that it's not just that he goes to the pain, but goes wherever it leads, but that's not enough. Then he has to follow it all the way through and push it to the extreme. So Bacon was always pleased to meet new people, as that surpassed his expectations. And ironically, it was a meeting with a Russian in Paris who told him, the important thing, Francis, is how you present yourself. Consequently, and of course, paradoxically, Francis said indeed that he had tried many ways to re-present himself, to reinvent himself, so much so that in the end the process had probably made him the most artificial person he knew, which is both funny, sad, and true. And this is the great contradiction. This is what captured me about Bacon and his art and his outlook, the genuine artificiality. It's a real fake. Like I mentioned at the start, really smart people seem to have worked this out. That it's all pretend, that it's not really real, but just responses to stimuli. And there are those who've worked it out, gamed the system so much, like political strategy and election modelling, the very game of finance itself, Bernie Madoff, Warren Buffett. Okay, they were both successful. One still is, the other got caught out. So maybe he was smarter than the average bear, and his intelligence allowed him to perpetuate the fraud longer than, say, a Mark Dwyer or a Nick Leeson. But it's interesting to note, and watching far too many episodes of American Greed than it's healthy, it's all about how you present yourself. The kind of modus operandi of Bernie was, shh, don't tell anyone, I only let in the elite. You're okay, you can come in, but don't tell anyone our little secret. Of course they're going to bloody tell everybody. So I've often wondered if it's really possible to run out of wonder. Can this be achieved in a human lifetime? Is it possible to travel everywhere and seen everything, to have had experience of all combinations of feelings? I like to pretend not. There's a bit of a restless gypsy in me. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, because you're always travelling, always looking, never settling. What's round the next corner? What's round the next corner? And you miss the beauty of the present right now, because you're always wondering what's over the next horizon. Yeah, note to self, I've always been about destination. I didn't mind for the journey. So the very notion that Bacon put forward about having worked on himself so much, taken on new beliefs and identities, that he remade himself so many times that he has become artificial, deliberately built, is itself a surreal thing to consider, and that's sort of so delicious. That self-improvement makes you better in the sense that it's more artificial. It's a paradox. The very notion of believing in oneself, apart from the wordplay of a lie being at the centre of every belief. A belief is easy, requires no evidence or supporting data. That it is just short of a delusion, something we pretend to be real so much that we literally make belief. And my mind kind of swims around this self-circular cesspit of delusion, but it seems this is what it's all about. The truth requires infinite investigation to get there. Belief, just take it on. Because of his travels and his preferences and how each culture repressed these deviants, in quotes, he recognised the masks and over time saw and recognised each disguise and what it really signalled. He worked out what was behind it all. The mystique removed, the masks told of the underlying secrets. Seems to me that many of us don't even get this far, yet Bacon went deeper, and I suspect this is why his art is so compelling. It's familiar, yet foreign. Perhaps we recognise the motifs which themselves are contorted, but in a way that conveys something about the conveyance before we even get to the subject matter. And I think that's the trick. The deeper you go, it's a reflection of our own perceptions, the abyss staring back and all that. Speaking of perceptions and filters, there's another saying that springs to mind, that the teacher appears when the student is ready. For example, I've read some amazing, insightful books recently, and they are books I'd only come to realise I'd actually read 10 years ago, but couldn't get, had no reference frame to see their value and largely forgot about. Running to walk and all that. Same with human needs, as Maslow pointed out. More or less, we all have the same needs to a lesser or greater extent, but how we go about getting them met is individually important. Something that the late Marshall Rosenberg pointed out, and this theme came through in the book about Bacon and the details around his life. So a word of caution though, and this was a life lesson for me, it's all fun and games in our 20s. In our 30s, we get to do it again with a bit more money and more resources. In later life, certain options are just not available, and to be harsh about it, the world changes, certain mechanisms change, social and cultural frameworks dry up or change, become obsolete, society changes, what's acceptable, or mechanisms or pathways of doing things are no longer there to support the old ways. The law even changes so that the way we used to go about getting our needs met sometimes becomes very, very difficult. Even if we are one of those rare creatures like a Hannibal Lecter or a vampire, unrestrained, all-powerful, limitless finances and vast resources, these rules, if you like, are inescapable. As we get older, it gets worse as our friends die, our cultural reference points die, those who share similar values and support systems die. And only when it's too late do we become acutely aware of our attachments to the methods of getting our needs met. And this one rocked me a bit. I'm not there yet, but it was a pretty harsh wake-up call. Law of requisite variety again. So I now see things in a new way. Why the politicians and power brokers stoke outrage to polarise an audience into two that can be manipulated and played off against each other rather than intractable thirds. All you need to do is control one side, which is easier. The greater the polarisation, the greater the degree of control. Just look at what's happening right now, the right, the alt-right and the left. It's all the rhetoric I'm hearing. What follows is concerning, or should be. I hope this time it will be an exception, for the one thing we do learn from history is that we do not learn from history. So kind of maybe why I'm big on the late Marshall Rosenberg and his nonviolent communication model. So Pepiat Books suggests that Bacon painted to excite himself. That's quite profound in the context of thinking about arousal, and if that does lead to lowering of inhibitions and the extremes that Bacon explored. The book suggests he did this to recapture some of the feelings and sensations of his experiences. I wonder too if this is a way of getting acceptance by proxy, that in the context of the 60s and the attitudes towards homosexuality of the times, that if he painted it, that if the viewer had an experience that was matched without the act, that not only did they have the experience or the sensations, but there was tacit approval and acceptance, that Bacon had circumvented the initial shield or barriers, social constraints, legal constraints, even inner constraints that words and linguistics and frameworks provide, that by avoiding narrative, by avoiding linguistic representation that provide triggers for particular meanings, that he'd managed to circumvent all that and allow through a new experience. And thinking about that, it's almost overwhelming to conceive of the notion that you can put colour on canvas and achieve that. It's difficult to explain, but there's almost a sensation of tension that always needs to be present. There needs to be an unanswered question that lingers in the air, and it's not even a question that the artist or Bacon himself would raise. It has to come from the viewer, the interlocutor, the opponent. They've got a question that they are seeking an answer to. So the work or the art or the ad copy or the persuasive text or the communication certainly needs to allude to, I see you have a question. Well, not even I have an answer, but let's just talk about that question. Let's explore it fully. And it seems to me that's going to really connect with people before the correction can come, if a correction is needed at all. Normally, I think when people are questioned or assisted in their questioning, they reach their own conclusion. That's fine. That's the way it should be, isn't it? Anything else is just pushing agendas and propaganda. But there's another aside. I'm going to kind of deviate a little bit now. I'm going to travel a little bit. I did do a longer version of this, a longer audio commentary, almost 8 hours. In fact, it was probably more than 8 hours. And in that, deviated to some of the Reddit blogs, Choosing Beggars, one of my favourites. Shouldn't spend time on there. But this is where people who have tried to blag free stuff, not wanted to pay or reciprocate in the transaction, have been mocked. At first it was funny, it attracted my attention. Then as I started to really get into it, you start to see patterns emerge. You start to see the masks and the charades that people play and the steps that they go through. And after a while, you start to see the tropes, the archetypes develop, and the opening gambit becomes obvious. I see where this one's going. And what was noticeable is that the choosing beggar seems to follow the Kubler-Ross model of grief. DABDA, as it's made for short. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Except some of them don't get to acceptance and just go back to denial, and so the cycle repeats. In other words, they're not learning. So, to run through the process, the choosing beggar, it's kind of a pejorative term for sure. We'll say something like, hey, I really like your artwork. Can I get one of those paintings? And the painter artist says, sure, $500. And then the choosing beggar, what? $500? $35 should be plenty. Because, of course, I know your circumstances and artwork only takes 2 minutes. Everybody knows that. Kind of denying reality. No, it's $500, take it or leave it, I have to get paid, justify my rent and so on and so forth. And then the bargaining stage. But please, I promised my child I'd get it for them, or that it looked really good on my wall. And, you'll get lots of exposure, because of course exposure pays the rent as well as Zen. No, still need $500. If I gave it to you for free, I'd have to give it to everyone for free. Then the depression stage. You're ruining my life. You're ruining the Christmas present I was going to promise my kid. I thought people were better than this. Why are you making things horrible? Well, you can still have it. $500, take it or leave it kind of thing. Then the anger phase. Fuck you. Who the hell do you think you are telling me how much I should pay for art? You're so unreasonable. Just cracks me up. Well, no, it's valuable art and, price is reflecting the value, Sure, it'll look good in your home for the Christmas present for the kid, but still $500. Yeah, well, your stuff's shit anyway, and I didn't want it. Or the other classic, well, you've missed out on this brilliant opportunity to get your work exposed to the world via my 5 followers on Instagram. It's just such a classic pattern. It's remarkable how do these patterns emerge? Because they clearly don't work, but they keep coming up. Where does it come from? Where did it arise? How is it this way? So, coming back on track a little bit, the irony is to get attention there needs to be impact, or a threat, or some pivot of anxiety, and it seems to me that we need to be able to parlay that into our intention, that there needs to be a chain of emotions, and I suppose this is where storytelling comes in, that's made so much about these days. The pace and lead model, and probably why so much is made of rapport. It's a kind of calibration, and I'm sure I've mentioned Gordon Ramsay before in his Hell's Kitchen in previous episodes, that he calibrates, tests, finds the tension or the dysfunction. It's a chain of anchors, if you like. We can't go from breaking into someone's mind straight away to a conclusion. Often the next step is one of curiosity. It's a mild anxiety. It's the rubbernecking stage. All the while, the prospect viewer has to have some notion that there's value there, that there's something to learn, there's something new here, there's a value. What can I get from it? What's in it for me? What will I be able to do? Bacon didn't follow the rules, as it were. He even painted on the back of his canvases, which, funnily enough, and to make the point about expectations, caught out many a would-be forger, as they presumed an artist would use the prepared side of the canvas. Bacon was amused by this, and aside from using the poor imitations as inspirations for new pieces, he said that he used the unprepared side because it grabbed the paint more, it absorbed quicker, was less forgiving to mistakes, and therefore you had to go with it to see where it led and not impose upon it. So there again is the underlying theme of arousal. Where does this lead? The curiosity, the tension, the not following the rules, not following prescribed form. That enabled him to focus on what was important and is the difference between meaning and technical merit. One says what's alive in us, what's important to you, what's the meaning of communication. The other says how well we've learned the structure of language and syntax and to follow the rules. And, for example, they say you should never start a sentence with and. Because. So yeah, I guess context matters too, and I suppose in that art is what Taleb describes as anti-fragile. It can be abstract, surreal, deconstructivist. But I suspect, and again, I'm not an artist nor even a casual observer really of art, but these labels came after the innovations. In other words, the contexts were an emergent phenomenon of the expression, and the labels are a lagging indicator. So it's all well and good being like Bacon, but to be like Bacon, you have to create the space so that the language and narrative follows after, and that you're not using narrative to carry. Again, come back to what Nietzsche said about discovering the past. So I kind of twisted myself into a chicken and egg with this. Did the context already exist, but because of sticking to dogma, rules of the day, it remains suppressed? Is this the value in the world then, that releasing these tropes means context upon the world, infusing new meaning? And again, by meaning I mean a new way of thinking about things, new perceptions, new filters, new possibilities. In other words, the meaning of the communication, or communication ultimately, is to change how people see things. Please see it from myself. Please understand me. Please, whatever. Thank you. It's all people seem to be saying. So, has art done its job if it changes what people think? Is that what art is? That old chestnut. That said, though, Bacon did feed on images from Picasso and the Surrealists, which were very foreign to what the English public were used to. I suppose that's a purple cow in modern parlance. And because the English people weren't used to it, I suppose they had no narrative. They had no context, no filters to categorise this. So it was like, oh, what's this? What's it supposed to mean? What do I think about it? What do other people think about it? What should I think? What does it mean? So I'm kind of left to conclude that this is how people judge the value of art. Has the communication in the mind of the receiver resulted in a change that is valuable to them? Here's a thought experiment, and it's off the back of the previous video on supplement empires and how to build an empire on vanity. So in the previous video we talked about stock market scams, and we started with an obvious example and ended on a more sophisticated version that obfuscates the simplistic nature. So let's do that again. Consider, if you will, a time when you were at school, perhaps thinking about English literature, writing specifically. And suffer for a moment, if you will, with a poor teacher who was compelled to read your shit. Do you really think that teachers are queuing up to read the mad ramblings of kids who barely got the basics of language? It's like being compelled to watch flat earther videos. At first it's funny, then you get angry, then you start to bargain with them. Then a deep depression sets in as you shed a tear for the future of humanity, and before long we start stealing the riddling from the students to pep us up. Just don't do drugs, say no. Finally, acceptance. Yeah. There's more to it than that. Encouragement, correction, testing things that improve, and then the efficacy of the lessons, seeing kids grow intellectually. I'm sure that's all very rewarding and so on. And no doubt that that's a big driver and motivational for many, many teachers. But for fun, I'd like you to imagine a paper or piece of work in isolation being given to someone to read and critique when they've got better things to do. Will they read it? No. I know, because I've done it. Now, same piece of work, and attach a £50 note or a $100 bill, and suddenly there is interest to give feedback. Great, wow, we've got interest. We've induced a behaviour, but now more problems. Problem A, because of reciprocity, can we expect an honest review for somebody who we've just paid for their opinion? Problem B, because we have paid for an opinion, does it make it valuable? Problem C, when we get good feelings when one piece is read by someone we overpaid for, when they say, great job, got any more? What they're really asking is not for more papers to read, but more £50 notes. But we misinterpret the signal. Something that seems to go on a lot in sales. So let's up the ante, and instead of a writing contest, it's a beauty contest. Or a bodybuilding one, a bikini one. Call me cynical, but holy shit, what's the difference between a Lee Haney, a Dorian Yates, or even a Schwarzenegger? Aesthetics. Arnold, more of the golden era of proportions. Haney, more massive and ripped, and Dorian Yates, a friggin' size monster. Even so, additional thought points for those of you who would say, yay, but they didn't compete against each other. Exactly, correct. The artificiality of the change in what is the benchmark of a bodybuilder, or what is beauty in a bikini contest. What makes the accolade of the best rather arbitrary, don't you think? It's what's in vogue right now. Kind of marketing 101 thing. Discover the audience, or the market first, then build the product to it. So, not to take away from all the hard work, not at all, but to come back to earth a little bit, to bring the example back. Consider beauty contest, the entrance fee. That's your £50 note attached to the piece of writing you want someone to critique. The sign-up fee, the money for the costume, the gym membership to get fit, get toned, the personal coach if you want to take it that far, and if you really want a good shot at winning, the requirement to do PR beforehand, get your name in front of the judges. And to do that, you have to have the right coach who has the ear of the judges. the coach who carries a good reputation as well, provenance, and who can get you centre stage rather than at the end of the line. All this costs money, and then even when all the other competitors have, I presume, worked just as hard as you win. You get the $5 trophy and part with more money for stage photos. You get the title for 1 year, and after that, the claim to fame was, I was once winner. It's more hit and miss than stapling that $50 to a piece of creative writing and asking, how good is this? The beauty contestant pays all that money, all that effort, for confirmation that yes, they are that good. Next year, new crop of hopefuls, new beauty contest keeps churning, more entrance fees, more sponsor money, more ticket sales. See where I'm going? I wonder, out of this year's 1,000 entrants, 1, 2, 3 get the stage and the fame, the rest, I don't know, I guess you got to have a strong frame of mind for it all. Yeah, sure, some will do that 6 hours down the gym per day anyway, might as well get paid doing it. Takes all sorts. On the face of it though, beauty contest, skin deep. Judgment on arbitrary aesthetics. More cynically, desire for approval and acceptance with a paid fee. Maybe that's harsh, sure, but there's money to be had if you can come in the top 1%. Celebs endorsements, deals, supplement deals. Get back to all that supplement empires that we talked about last time. Sure, it can be inspiring, gets people in the gym, not shitting on it, whatever. But this seems to be, the model of business and enterprise. News broadcasters, paid by the number of words written or spoken, or are they paid by the value to be found in those words? New York Times, Washington Post, what's your favourite newspaper? Do you read it for the critical analysis or to be entertained? Honestly? So I'm sure there's a strong sense that those articles in those newspapers confirm the reader's bias and prejudice and massage their approval so that they keep buying the rag. So that sufficient numbers of buyers or subscribers enables the proprietors to charge advertisers more for specific space to an already well-defined segregated demographic. The readership is paying for its own approval, paying for attention. Yeah, and because that's more fun than being challenged with critical thinking on objective information, easy to get someone else to do thinking. And to a certain degree, that is what journalism is supposed to be, to explain complicated issues. But if it's also entertaining and fun and strokes the ego and gives good feelings and hits those cognitive biases that Thaler, Kahneman and Munger have written at length about, then sure, you've got one more reader for at least one more day, one more week, one more month, whatever. So it suddenly struck me as amusing that when this process becomes obvious to the reader, subscriber or follower, there is again the Kubler-Ross model process of behaviour that follows. So something in the Times or in the Washington Post or in the bikini contest or in the judgment made broke the spell, so that the follower suddenly had their suspension of disbelief violated in such a way, shock, tension, that they became aware of being exploited. Shock. But it wasn't their ignorance that allowed them to be exploited. It was that outrage and mistakes and that rag. Denial. Followed by outrage that their icon or trusted source is a sellout, just going after the numbers. And then they express their anger, letter to the editor. Followed by depression. Who can you trust? It's all shit, they all lie. Now what? And here, at choice point, opportunity to learn, to accept their own ignorance. Or do they pin their hopes and continue into denial and latch on to a new guru who promise excitement and new answers and the way, a new novelty and the new guilty pleasure? And so we bounce from conspiracy to conspiracy. But this is the bad habit we learned in school. We were taught implicitly that what we wrote, what we said, what we did got us attention or approval, or praise or reward, not because what we said or did was valuable, but because someone was paid to care. In the real world, don't work like that. And as Bacon knew, approval is just another addiction. Just don't bore people. When it's hard for people, when it's challenging, just like with rubbernecking, the cognitive overload creates a bottleneck. They slow down, then they don't understand, go to confusion, get overloaded and annoyed, and then it's no fun, so they stop. Worse, they're also susceptible to suggestion as their cognitive mind is overloaded, and it can just slide in those unconscious signals, embedded commands, analogical markings, and all sorts of foolishness. Anyway, yeah, so when it's not fun, when it's annoying and frustrating, they just stop. And if they're unlucky, get in an accident themselves. So we've got to keep it fun, entertaining. At least then their miserable existence and pitiful lives become bearable, if but for a moment. So this is the difference between caretakers, teachers, coaches and mentors, and it also strikes me that there are a lot of people out there that claim to be coaches but don't know these differences. Different management styles for different levels. So you've got behaviour level, skills level, capacity level, values and beliefs level, identity and purpose level, all require different motivations, different encouragement, different management styles, management by exception, contingent reward, inspirational management, so on and so on. Anyway, not getting into that on this one. So I think, certainly for me, there's a bit of confusion about how ego gets in the way. I've not read Holiday's book yet, and I'm not entirely sure what the ego is. I keep hearing about it, but I have a notion that our school years and early teens taught us more or less to demonstrate what we knew and what we could do in the context of the classroom, and someone, a teacher, was paid to care. So that boils it down a bit, but it seems this neediness in business and neediness in life, the search for approval, the roundabout ways we go about demonstrating capacity or proving ourselves, sometimes masquerading as vying for attention. The assumption that underlines it all is that what we believe, what we've previously considered as important, we've mistakenly believed as important to others or of value to others, which it isn't. Connection before correction. But we still carry on making the same mistakes. What we have, what we believe is important, and we can prove it. If only you would stop, if only you would listen, if only you would understand me, if only you agreed with me. But no one does stop, no one listens, no one understands you, so we go on kidding ourselves that what we have is valuable, and we are certain in that belief because no one, to this point, has said it isn't, or no one's been able to challenge it, because no one stopped long enough to listen to the bullcrap. So, the Kubler-Ross process goes back into the denial. So hopefully you can see why it doesn't work, and I think that's clearer than saying, your ego got in the way, son, though it did sound good in Top Gun when Commander Stinger said it in a much more embellished way to Maverick. Yeah, that was fun and entertaining, but rather ambiguous, no clear direction. Emphasises the point though, doesn't it? But it wasn't merit that got Mav to Top Gun, it was that the number one choice turned in his wings. And that's another thing, giving clear direction. Good writers control the reading process, good filmmakers control the tone, and I guess good artists control the thinking and discovery process. But it seems more than that, because superficially the painting can be passed by, so they don't want to start with the obvious, but there seems to be a much deeper appreciation of what goes on in people, and in Bacon's case, he said that this was not a conscious thing. Perhaps not, but knowing that he travelled to the underground scene in Berlin and Paris and London, later Tangiers, and all that he sought out was difference or new extremes, the presumption we must hold is that he knew something or saw things that we have not, and that they are present in his paintings and are there for us to find. And another presumption is that the artist must know that we know that they know, and now the game starts. Same in filmmaking. There are the hidden messages, hidden nods and homages, subtext and deeper questions to be asked by the ambiguous representations. And one of my favourite examples is the obelisk in 2001, Space Odyssey. 2001, A Space Odyssey. The title is not 2001, an outer space odyssey, just a space odyssey. The spacecraft and the moon is the subterfuge that entertains. It creates enough curiosity and enough drag to pull the film through, but it is the part that cognitively overloads the conscious watcher, because they're all saying spacecraft, moon, obelisk, what does it all mean? And they get too busy, too fixated on that, and the hidden meanings, the unconscious signals slide right in. So what is it all about? What could all that mean? Well, the use of rectangles in that film is just a little bit overboard, don't you think? The rectangle that Hal is centred in, the food trays that contain different arrays of food themselves, little compartments of different coloured food in those food trays that are actually the same ratio of width to height as the tray itself, as the obelisk. Very careful and purposefully put there. Why? And in the same ratios. Why? Well, it's a metaphor. Space is the cinema screen itself. That is the Odyssey. It's a clever abstract commentary. The rectangle of the screen upon which the movie is projected is the space, and you are on an odyssey of asking questions. The food trade's another space through which you select your flavour of propaganda, your flavour of food, your confirmation bias. Which do you like to feed yourself the most? Which films do you like to watch? Which TV news or newspapers do you subscribe to? Your biases nourished and confirmed. And then the Matrix. I can get lost in that one. Lots been said about that and the trifecta of commerce, religion and perception. White rabbits indeed. Or how about the proposition that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was actually an animal rights film? Animal rights? Yeah, animal rights is boring stuff. Who'd watch that but wrap it up in a narrative of a serial killer that has no mercy nor compassion for slaughtering young and defenceless victims with a seemingly insatiable and gluttonous lust for torture and killing for pleasure, surplus to actual nourishment requirements? Well, maybe watch again with that in mind. Then comes the interesting question, why was it banned? Because of the violence, commensurate with what the producers saw in the food industry and animal welfare practices of the time? Or did the powers that be realise what it actually was? Ooh, we can't have this go out. No thinking, but no specific answer. Perhaps they went too far in being too outrageous. Seems there is a fine line. Tension is one thing, but going too far and stretching it until it snaps and you get blowback, and probably legal trouble, as the 80s metal band Wasp found out, but that's another story. Incredibly underrated band, amazing lyrics, incredible stage productions, good stuff. Anyway, so back to the point, and to state it explicitly, telling, boring, show don't tell, better, make a good argument, better still, but starting to load on the cognitive drain. Can be taxing and overloading. Best approach, communicate what question will be answered. Builds curiosity, then the person's invested in finding out and discovering it, so they'll invest a bit more cognitive load. And finally, even more profound is to communicate what questions you, the reader, the viewer, the watcher, or the audience member have that will be answered. In other words, it speaks to the audience directly. It involves them. It's answering the questions they have, not answering the questions that you make up for them to be curious about, as in, that's interesting that somebody else has that question. That was an interesting... If it gets too heavy, I'll leave. But my questions, I'm going to get an answer, finally, for something that I've asked, or wanted to ask, or wanted to know for so long. It makes room for the audience, and for me, that's what Bacon did. And that's especially noteworthy since it seems to me that society at the time, and even his own parents, did not. They even told him that he was ugly and that no one would like him. That's one reason I would attribute greatness to him, to overcome that, to not fall for it, to not buy into it, to find his own way. So it's not just the painter expressing himself or indulging himself. The viewer or observer is involved. In that respect, Bacon must have had a strong inclination of the viewer's questions. They too are human after all and suffer the same afflictions. Later on, he would do commissioned portraits, but was seldom happy with those, and if I recall correctly, he would eventually refuse a portrait unless he knew the person very well. And again, I would posit that getting to know people meant knowing what deep down questions they had. It's an interaction, not an imposition. It's a connection, not a correction. So going back to poor and habitual thinking for a moment, and perhaps where scientists do themselves a bit of a disservice. See, Death of Expertise, Winning Bigly, interesting reads. Not quite sure I agree with the latter's narrative, but anyway, it's coming back to scientists and the communication to the laity, the way it's often expressed. So consider, after a few years, decades of dedicated work on projects that consume millions of dollars to discover something hitherto unknown, it is true of the scientist's claim, I know something you don't, and what you think you knew is wrong. Factually correct statement. And with that, they've just obliterated the value to the audience because no one likes to be informed that they're wrong. It's presumptuous, imposing, and disengaging. It says, this is what I know about the world. That old habit from school again. And it comes in many disguises of communication. Some people think, or up until now, community has thought, which is basically again saying, I know, you don't, no, and I want my gold star, because I'm better than you. Seems humans have a built-in detector for this stuff, and it plays an important role in the diffusion of innovation. Another good book, another podcast. But Bacon was an innovator, and it took a while, but it did catch on. The early adopters, early majority, and so on. People would ask him the meaning of his paintings. He would not concede that there was such a thing. I wonder if this was a polite way to avoid revealing what was in his head, and that his interpretation was the right one, and even to say that's up to the appraiser is also an imposition of presumption. Maybe it doesn't mean anything to them, and that there is no value for some viewers. We can't know that. Of course, this just made him more enigmatic, but I think he knew. He knew that he could not tell people what they saw, what they ought to see, what they thought or ought to thought, that the meaning that they concluded was the wrong one. The closest he came to that was when he said he was just happy that people would take the time to look at the paintings. He was a smart fellow, and knowing that he knew about people, and the charades and the masks that they all wear, and the use of disguised and coded language, I'm pretty sure he was very careful of avoiding saying, "I know what you're thinking. And you're wrong." Even with clever rhetoric and linguistic tricks to state that in a polite way that can't be challenged or rub people the wrong way, he still avoided it. Instead, there was an empathy and appreciation of needs, but expressed visually, viscerally, cut to the bone, no fluff, no pretense, raw. "Well, there it is, you see," I'm sure he would say. Each community has its own codes of value too, and Bacon, being well-travelled, both literally and mindfully, surely would have been well-versed in spotting codes, motifs, tropes, tip-offs, memes, traits, coded language, and be able to use these signals to signal his value back to those communities, using the consistent coded language. I reckon this is why he was comfortable with his high society elite circles, to the underground bars of Berlin, to London's 1960s underground and criminal fraternities. He quickly worked out what people held as valuable, and the codes, icons, and metaphors that not only conveyed value, but conveyed something about the conveyance itself. Now, the big secret. Entertainment. What's it all about? What do people find entertaining? Well, on YouTube, it's the fail army. Schadenfreude, pointing out hypocrisy, failure and downfall of righteous, moral indignation and righteous outrage. We're drawn to conflict and tension and trouble, and in lesser ways, to the distractions of soap operas and common gossip. Least engaging on this scale, and that just helps us feel better, is to have our confirmations and judgments validated. We find it engaging and mildly entertaining. Consequently, direct threats against us get our full attention, and then just violence in general, and then general outrage, fluvial language, recreational outrage, memes, and at the other end of that attention spectrum are photographs of content diners who had an okay time at an average restaurant in an average city, but holy shit, press the outrage, conflict and tension buttons. Well, I'm getting right on the rant, and we've covered this a little bit already in podcast 12. And around about the 22-minute mark, we outlined the notions of beliefs and how they describe our relationship to limits, causes and meaning. Also coming around to accept the notion that language is a relationship with people. It's an interaction, a tool more than an idea or a concept. Therefore, it's about the counterparty as much as about us. Same with good books, same with painting and art. And Jack Storm expressed this wonderfully. So check out his glass sculptures on YouTube if you haven't already, as featured in Guardians of the Galaxy, Part 1, Volume 1. Jack Storm has an interview process with prospective clients. Just to save you some time, he makes glass sculptures. And that kind of sounds a bit pompous, but he's really establishing a communication and commitment from both sides to develop an idea or a concept whereby both contribute to a collaborative creation. And cynical as I may sound, it seems to me that the one thing prospects don't do in sales, for example, is argue with their own data or own specifications. Connection before correction, discovery and learning, meeting of the minds must occur before any contracts or agreements. So, the language becomes critical, and the notion of opening conversations of discovery with the opening gambit, "Look what I know that you do not," doesn't seem the best way. And in this, Bacon was what might be described as humble, accepting, non-judgmental, and always friggin' learning, exploring, tasting. But he knew people are easily bored. Recall the story of the woman who threw her dog from the window. To make it clear, crystal, entertainment, intrigue, curiosity, tension are created by a context of instability, a volatile environment, changing of behaviours. In fact, change or instability on any level, environment, behaviour, skills, values, beliefs, identity, role, purpose, any one of those levels can be tap danced on. Even life itself. And I'm sure I've quoted this one before. Life, a remarkable emergent phenomenon of sustained order and complexity, For living systems, disorder is death, and living systems cheat death by importing energy to maintain necessary order. Living things constantly build order to overcome the tendency towards disorder. It takes all the running you can to keep in the same place. It's a dynamic and emergent phenomena between two boundary conditions. Life itself is a tension, and I suspect the greats like the late Bacon knew this, either consciously and explicitly or at more unconscious and intuitive level, but were able to channel their artistic skills from those places in either case. Bacon said much of his painting was done unconsciously, and though I'm not even an amateur critic, the pieces kind of fit. Correlation or causation? Maybe just my confirmation bias. Maybe just after your validation, dear viewer. It's not just about the art, though, that made him successful. He was a bit of a power player, too. We touched on this briefly, and I'd hate to go off on another tangent, well, you wouldn't want consistency, would you? Maybe this is insightful. We wouldn't want to miss out on a key to success. So recall the beauty contests. Who has the power to determine the win? Judges, correct. So who needs to be influencers? Yep, judges. So what's the next question? And with David Sandler here, everything by agreement. And if you want to know how to do sales really good, look for your local Sandler trainer. And if you happen to be in the southeast of England, look for Marcus Cowkey. Cantankerous, outrageously expensive, but... So the Sandler method seeks to build what's known as upfront contracts. It's a series of mini agreements that, when completed, results in the contract. So in a bikini or bodybuilding contest, that next question would be, Judge, what are the criteria for awarding the winner specifically? Judge gives the details. Are there instances where this is not the case? Check for exception. And what are those? So, given the scenarios and these parameters, and if this happened, would that mean that you're compelled to award a win? Okay, so if a contestant does look like this, does this behaviour, and falls into that category, you said that they will be awarded the win. Yes. Okay, there you go. Agreement. Or you can maybe ask, okay, and if not, why not? And drill down so you've covered every conceivable pathway. Now you should have been able to discover the critical path that describes the process and obligates the judge to follow it, such that if the contestant followed and did those things, then it's a foregone conclusion. Then you just have to make the contestant look and do those things in such a way that the judge has to follow the agreement that they've just laid out. In other words, you give power what it wants so that it can give you what you want. Judges might have interests that you don't know about, and if you don't ask, you'll never know. So you think it's a bikini contest, but the whole business is really a sponsorship deal, and in this case they're going to have to work with the winner for a year afterwards, or whatever the deal is, and that will have a factor over and above the looks, but on the face of it, it's just a beauty contest. So you have to know how and why power makes the decisions it does and fit into it. Sometimes power won't tell you. Oh, well, then it's just a crapshoot, and likely in that scenario you're just fodder, and no real value is exchanged. It's just a spin on a roulette wheel. Sometimes power won't tell you because they don't want you to know. Or maybe even they don't know, and why would you get into business with someone who does not know how they make decisions? In either case, where there's doubt, there is no doubt. And when writing ad copy, who has the power to decide to buy your product? And how do they make decisions? Do you know? Have you asked? Or are you guessing and hoping? And when making YouTube videos, where's the power? Still ain't worked that one out myself yet, so here we are. Lazy. How does the algorithm work? Do you know, or are you guessing? And when getting your paintings into exhibitions and galleries, who has the power to make it happen? Who is the decision maker, and what are their incentives? What are they looking for to get out of it? What's in it for them and all that? Do you know? Have you asked? Or are you just hoping to get noticed? Again, Bacon was great here. He saw the codes. He knew what power wanted. He was excellent at navigating these worlds. The subject matter he chose, the crucifixion, evocative, and everyone knows of the crucifixions, a well-travelled meme. There is a lot going on in crucifixions, lots of emotional tensions and lots of extremes, lots of different perceptual positions, depending on which side of that fence you want to take. It's a good one to pick, and Pepiat makes a lot about paradoxes in the book. The ultimate is self-circular, self-violating, self-supporting, self-perpetuating tension. Almost the very definition of a viral marketing campaign. And then one would wonder why an atheist would take such interest in these matters. Yeah, why? Bacon's paintings broke aesthetic convention too. Ooh, controversy, outrage. The book contains quotes from critics of the day which reveal more about the critic's state of mind than the work. It's all about me. I know something that you don't. I know how to critique work and you don't. And I know what's good and you don't. All that business again. So it's interesting to note specifically that the critics here really demonstrating what they know, what's in their head, than being aware of the questions that the readers have. In other words, self-indulgent bores. Just don't bore people. Anyway, often Bacon would not start working on new works until very close to the exhibition date. Incredibly, it is said that some of his works hung on the walls of the gallery while the paint was still wet. On the face of it sounds spectacular, but it can take a couple of days for that process anyway. Even so, that's cutting it fine. But imagine the pressure and the tension he would have put himself under, and I'm wondering if that forced him to let go of worry and concern. In a way, it gave him permission to fail. Once that's assumed, only success remains. The book states specifically that during these periods, Bacon would paint with enormous intensity. From an early exhibition, there was one piece he did regret destroying because it featured what he later called a very beautiful wound. A contradiction. How can a wound be beautiful? Well, call me crazy if you like, but I actually find scars attractive. They show someone has lived, gone to or been involved in extreme or very traumatic events and survived and come out stronger, been places I'll likely never get to. I'm not one for tattoos, but the appeal and psychology of tattoos is interesting, but scarification is where it's at. Hardcore, beautiful wounds. Bacon described being in love a little bit like this. Being totally and physically obsessed by someone is like having some dreadful disease. Early on, he would hold exhibitions at his studio in Curzon Street, London. Nice address. With the Corner Hotel just on the corner there, I doubt you'll find any flat available there for less than £1 million, and a 3-bedroom flat will hit you for about 3.5 million. And if you can actually find one, 11 million for a 4-bedroom flat, and well, 20 million properties there are not the exception. Also, early on, he had sponsors. Rich people who would buy his early works. Not only rich, but well connected. This is where provenance in art crops up. It's not just that the paintings are selling, it's who is buying them. I'm reminded of a little quip here uttered by my man Stalin. It matters not who the voters are, it matters who the counters are. Nevertheless, Bacon liked to drink too. Hardcore in that respect, and he liked to gamble hard. I wonder if this was to create tension that required or compelled him to paint more, or whether it was to find the edges of risk. This reminds me a little bit of David Goggins and Jocko Willink. Just how close to death can he get and get away with it? Where is that boundary? With Bacon, was this by choice or by chance? Nature or nurture? A choice of compulsion, freedom to drift, or an addiction? Does it matter? However, my sense is that it was by design, and I have a little bit of evidence to back up that claim. While out on a bender, concerned friends would try to ease him off the booze. No such thing as too much, he would say, and then have at least one more drink. This was not to be a dick, but a test of self. If he stopped drinking at the point, the question would remain, was it his choice, or was it that of the influence of his friends that was actually the driving force? And if it's the latter, what happens if his friends are not around in future to shepherd him? That sets up a dependency, so the only way to know that it's one's own choice to stop is to have one more drink, and then see if you can stop by choice, but only after one more. It's only by going too far that you can hope to break the mould and do something new. Art is a question of going too far, said Bacon. Only by going too far, a favourite phrase of Bacon's, ran, will you get anywhere at all. In that context, these phrases go beyond cool sound bites, but into practical learning points about self-development and embodiment of hard-earned experience. And for me, that's also evident in his paintings. We might be grateful, even, that we can, if only just for a short while, experience what he did, for a fraction of the price paid, just like the flute story in that Star Trek episode. One more thing that came through in the book was the exhibitors would use clouded language or codes to justify the decision not to include Bacon's work in their galleries. Not surreal enough, was one. What does that even mean? Obviously, for whatever reason, power, in this case, doesn't want to give a real reason. Such is the nature of power sometimes. Of course, that impasse can be leveraged with outrage marketing, but beware of upsetting and embarrassing power. or at least power that matters to you. And Bacon was not afraid, or perhaps it didn't even occur to him to speak his mind and ridicule power where he was disinterested and anti-fragile to the consequences. Then there were the Furies, deities of vengeance, and Bacon would comment that they visited him often, alluding to what he considered the most insidious punishment of all, guilt. Anyway, Bacon stated that if the meaning of his paintings could be conveyed with words, then he would not need to go to the effort of painting them. But that wasn't a lazy excuse. It almost meant he was obligated to put in paint that which could not be conveyed by words. His litmus test was that if an image resisted logical or coherent verbal explanation, then it worked. This is why he resisted the imposition or appropriation by narrative. He claimed he was not an expressionist and that the pictures meant nothing, said nothing, that he had nothing to express. Perhaps. But he did say he was just exciting himself via his paintings. Bacon was fascinated by people's sexual behaviour, and it seems the point is that this is when people are the most honest about themselves. Again, arousal, inhibition, lowerings. Fascinating looking at big data that is gathered from porn sites. Yeah, it's a time when people are honest in their decisions. One does what one does to get one off, or fakes it, I guess, but that doesn't strike me as particularly satisfying. Story for another day. Much in the same ethos as collecting big data, Bacon would consciously lower his input filter so that he could see, experience and integrate a wider gamut than most. Again, we are in somewhat of a debt to him for this. It saves our sensitivities from a brutal onslaught of the things that go on behind closed doors, in gay nightclubs, in the criminal underworld, at the extremes of behaviour. Truly, original art was bound to offend. Not that I think that he sought this out as a strategy, but rather as a consequence. Have you ever noticed when you argue with fundamentalists about their beliefs that often, when you really ram it up against them and shove their hypocrisy and lies and intellectual dishonesty right back up their arse, they rage quit with the parting words, "You make me sick." And I suspect this is more true than they realise. For the first time, they've thought for themselves, and it is nauseating, it is uncomfortable to realise that their entire foundation of belief is baseless, a falsehood, a lie, a wicked seed that mentally stunted and abused them all their lives. And now, they just had a thought for the first time of their own. Yeah, I've had a couple of my lifelong beliefs kicked out in a couple of minutes. It's quite disconcerting. And Bacon said of his works, they are just an attempt to make a certain type of feeling visual. Painting is the pattern of one's nervous system being projected on the canvas. Jackson Pollock said the same thing, and I wonder, is this a way of expressing feelings as a barometer for how the artist's needs are being met in life? Furthermore, Pepiat notes Bacon needed high drama and extremities to feed his paintings. In conversation, Bacon said, "To find yourself, you need the greatest possible freedom to drift. We all need to be aware," he said, "of the potential disaster that stalks us every day." At one art class he agreed to talk to, he said what modern man needs is a kind of shorthand, and then that was taken as an article of faith. Or perhaps he was aware that this is what happens and why he shouldn't be telling people what they ought to find meaning in things. He also needs to shock all comfortable expectation and remain clearly and subversively untamed by his own success. Tricky indeed, almost like the desire to not have desires. He said one needs specific images to unlock the deeper sensation. It had been noted that Bacon worked from a specific to the generalised rather than from the generalised to the specific. And he was an admirer of Giacometti's sculptures and recognised the need to take human appearance to the edge of dissolution by reducing it to its essence, also lay at the heart of his own ambition as a maker of images. He said a picture should be the recreation of an event rather than an illustration of an object, but there is no tension in the picture unless there is a struggle with the object. Yes, tension, the drama, the volatility. It raises the question, and then people want to know what the answer is. The extremes of existence were the constant theme of the portraits, exploring the points of human existence between tension and collapse, horror and fulfillment. Again, I can't help but notice the trope, archetype of a Hannibal Lecter. Charming, brilliant, smart, almost nurturing on one hand, and then a sadistic, murdering, psychopathic bastard on the other. The contradiction between the two almost offers an unresolvable enigma. How can this be so? What happened? What's the story? Same kind of thing. It's as though the pressure he put himself under to paint was an induction of tension, and sometimes he wrote to the gallery, pushing back Exhibition dates, I suspect, much like the insistence of having one more drink. Who am I stopping for? To appease friends, or am I doing it for myself? Who am I painting for? To appease a gallery, or for myself? Am I going to bow to the pressure, or am I going to fight for freedom? Am I compelled by the exhibition, or do I remain free to drift? How far can I push back that date? How far can I push this relationship before it breaks? Nevertheless, he maintained throughout his life the futility of it all. We come from nothing, and we will go to nothing, as the bedrock of his belief. However, this was not a pessimistic cry, but an optimist opportunity. Since it all is a charade, therefore, we might as well try and be brilliant about it. Yeah, I think this relates to someone who has worked out the codes, the tropes, the archetypes, and people's responses to particular stimulus, and after a while it does become a charade, after a while it does become boring, after a while it does become tempting to play with people. And one way to look at it is, if it is all arbitrary, then it is all pointless. And another way to look at it is, if it is all arbitrary, then pick the best, at no cost of loss to the worst. Bacon once said, I decided when I was very young that I would have this extraordinary life, going everywhere and meeting everyone. But of course, he would add, not unguiltily, I used everybody along the way. He was 40 before he had his first big show, and it seems building an empire of value takes time. In a short time after, he hit his stride, and his paintings were fetching prices that could actually sustain him financially. Apart from funding his drinking and paying gambling debts and basic sustenance, he was overly generous with money. It seemed like he used money for its main purpose, to spend. Money was something to spread around thickly and quickly, and it wasn't just money he spent thickly, but also time with friends who were in real need at crisis points. Later, he would say, when I was young, I needed extreme subject matter for my paintings. Then, as I grew older, I began to find my subject matter in my own life. With his exploits, wide and varied circles of friends, and with age, and with the loss of friends, breakups with his partners, experiences for the low life of crime, to the other end of high-stakes crimes found at Monte Carlo, and all the gangsters, prostitutes, and high society between, he realised he no longer needed the frameworks of the Greek or Christian tragedies. He could use his own life as a reference point. To put it in Bolotto's terms, he had travelled. He had deviated. Village, town, city, and global mileage, as it were. He would witness all sorts of depraved acts, violent acts, faces swollen in lust, twisted in fear, and recorded what he saw without judgment or sentimentality. Right out of Dweck's teachings. Something I also got from reading a Bernie Eccleston book. Well, it was a book by Tom Bauer about Bernie Eccleston. And Bernie used to say, let's not have a debate, let's have a decision. And Bernie's secret to success was based on the notion of never getting emotional in business. Make decisions, give options. On getting revenge, don't threaten, just do it. Sidestep aggression, outbursts reveal weakness. And Bernie also had a knack for the mystique. And now I think about it, the two actually had quite a lot in common. An example of this, another artist, quite famous, met with Bacon. I've always wanted to meet you because you are the only non-abstract painter worth consideration, he said, adding, although, of course, you're not a painter, you don't know the first thing about painting. And Bacon replied, good, I think my work is perfectly horrible. Now can we get together? You can teach me how to paint and I'll lend you my genius. And reading other materials and watching documentaries about art, reading around the subject a little bit, the sale of art, it seems an art in of itself, and the mischief that goes on, well, I guess largely by consent and by beware, emptor, caveat and all that. I can see the appeal and the rush of it all. It's a long game with many factors, almost an optimization game in of itself. Future speculations as to the marketability, the appeal, the prestige, the longevity, the actual hoarding of niche pieces to drive up market prices, and then to sell them without dumping the price or paying taxes by use of free ports, offshore accounts, must be exhilarating. All the while, with success, Bacon was still fascinated by the rich and their follies. Once, while visiting a rich bitch at her opulent home, he noticed she had plastic flowers around the place rather than real ones. The whole point, Bacon noted, was that real flowers die. The comparison and struggle seems akin with his works. He would go to Tangiers with enthusiasm to do great works, but return with a few pieces out of many abandoned or destroyed works. And in reference to his enigma and mystiques, Bacon admitted that some of his best works were done under pressure, while drunk or hungover, while he had no idea what he was doing. Lots to unpack in that. Unconscious competence and a strategy to remove the conscious second guessing and just go with flow. Yeah, I must get around to reading Mihail Csikszentmihalyi's book. If there was any criteria for his paintings, it could be that any narrative content or anything that could be told through the brain before it makes an assault on the nervous system weakens the image. In NLP, there's this notion of first access and second access, or as Bolotto describes, filters. In simple form, we know what a chair is because we've seen many of them before and have an unconscious perception filter of what chair is and what chair is not. And therefore, I think it's not unreasonable to say that a creative would have to work quite hard to make something that defies categorization of our perception filters. Yeah, even trickier when we're now sophisticated to have, that's an abstract art filter, or even a sensitivity to be alert to something that is not abstract enough. Maybe, like I said, I learned to think about art. Even trickier then, in the mind of an artist who surely must ask the question, give me something novel that has no narrative. Kind of weird to think about, no? Not even that though, it seems to be about new feelings, something I'm kind of relating to as I get older. It's the same old numb feelings that recycle through the physiology, and life seems so humdrum. There's nothing like that first time of feeling. Well, fill in your own first time feeling. What was it for you? Sex, drugs, gambling, fast cars? Skydive. Not quite so ambitious, diving off a 25-metre board, 10-metre dive. Diving with the sharks. Yeah. Anyway, after a very successful exhibition in London, it went on the road, Mannheim, Turin, Zurich, Amsterdam, Madison Avenue even, and in an interview at those times, thinking New York, Bacon stated explicitly, we can try to enjoy life and hope to go on exciting ourselves in different ways. What else is there? To find this excitement, one should be allowed the greatest possible freedom in order to drift. Apart from that, we can watch our own decay in the interval that separates life from death. And with Nietzsche, I believe that man must remake himself. We must woo the doctors and scientists in the attempt to renew and alter ourselves, but there will be a lapse of time before the religious hangover will allow them to act freely. The division between the sexes has to a large extent been invented. Only a comparatively small number of people are active within this division. The rest are waiting for something to happen or be done to them, but society has attempted to make moral differences. We must have freedom to drift and find ourselves again. I have deliberately tried to twist myself, he said, but I have not gone far enough. My paintings are, if you like, a record of this distortion. Photography has covered so much in a painting that's even worth looking at. The image must be twisted if it is to make a renewed assault on the nervous system. Life is so meaningless. We might as well try to make ourselves extraordinary. In point of fact, Bacon loved the extremes of waking in the grim discomfort of his living quarters and working in the studio's cramped chaos before appearing for dinner, impeccably groomed in the hushed opulence of a grand hotel. One extreme to the other. I like that. Each extreme defines and appreciates the other. What fascinated him, he often remarked, was the distance between the two. Staying long in either state would have seemed tedious. Yes, exactly. There's that tension again, the contradiction, the volatility. Like Picasso, he wanted to be rich enough to live like a poor person without the restraints of bourgeois convention. Although he did not believe in any form of afterlife, Bacon believed passionately in art's supreme function in this life to give substance and meaning to what he called the brief interlude between birth and the grave. Only by expressing the chaos of emotions inside us, the artist held, was there any chance of coming to terms with the confusion.